And hello, it's Scotland at 7. It's Thursday the 13th of January. I'm Hugh Stewart in the Glasgow studio. And joining me tonight to discuss the stories is Paul McLennan, MSP, and you're in the Scottish Parliament office just now, aren't you, Paul?
So, yeah, I am, yeah.
Good evening. Thanks for joining us. So, Paul, I'm going to run through today's coronavirus numbers and then we'll discuss the top stories. So, first of all, as of 2 p.m. today, there are a reported 8,203 cases which have been reported either using the LFD, lateral flow device, or a PCR polymerase reaction positive test. Sorry, I'll just go for that again. That was 8,203 cases positive using one of those tests. There are 26 new reported deaths of people who had tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,997. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,560 were in hospital last night, 58 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. today, 4,395,793 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination. 4,057,606 had received a second dose, and 3,159,109 had received the third dose or booster. The latest UK daily figures show 151,342 patients who had tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness. And that's an increase of 335 since yesterday. That number refers to deaths in all settings and not just in hospitals. Our top story tonight: the Queen has removed a range of military affiliations and royal patronages held by Prince Andrew, Buckingham Palace has said. The move comes after a US judge gave the green light for her second son to face a sexual assault civil lawsuit. In a statement today, Buckingham Palace said, with the Queen's approval and agreement, the Duke of York's military affiliations and royal patronages have been returned to the Queen. The Duke of York will continue not to undertake any public duties and is defending this case as a private citizen. The dramatic move comes hours after more than 150 military veterans wrote to the Queen to ask her to strip Andrew of his honorary military roles amid what they describe as their upset and anger. The palace had said earlier on Thursday that it had no comment on their open letter. Writing to her in her capacity as the head of state, Commander-in-Chief of the Army, Navy and Air Force, an open letter from the former members of each of the services said it was untenable for the Duke of York to retain his positions. With this any senior military officer, it is inconceivable that he would still be in post, they say in the letter sent on the day after the Manhattan judge rejected Prince Andrew's efforts to dismiss Virginia Goffrey's sexual assault lawsuit against him. The Duke denies the allegations against him. The palace had previously said that the Duke's military appointments were in abeyance after he stepped down from public duties in 2019, but he still retained the roles in 8 British regiments, including the Grenadier Guards, where he has held the title of Colonel, Honorary Air Commodore of RAF Lossiemouth, Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal Irish Regiment, Colonel-in-Chief of the Small Arms School Corps, Commodore-in-Chief of the Fleet Air Arm, Royal Colonel of the Royal Highland Fusiliers, and Deputy Colonel-in-Chief of the Royal Lancers, that's the Queen Elizabeth's own, and finally Royal Colonel of the Royal Regiment of Scotland. So it looks like Prince Andrew will have plenty of time to fight that lawsuit. Well, that's 2 princes gone. One went voluntarily and one's been asked to, well, at least to stay quiet. So the family business seems to be crumbling. Is this a terminal crisis for the royal family, Paul?
I'm not sure it's a terminal crisis for the royal family. I think in terms of Prince Andrew, I think he's in a very difficult position now, and I think obviously the civil case in the States, I think, has obviously pushed him on where he's lost that, and it's very likely to go to a civil case. And listening to the radio this morning, I know it's I think it's not just the civil side of the case that the defendant's talking about and the accuser is talking about. I think they're obviously looking not just for civil, but to take it to an actual judicial court as well. So I think I can understand the decision by the royal family. Whether that impacts them terminal below that, I'm not sure. But it's certainly a very difficult position for Prince Andrew at the moment.
Yes, so indeed, this is, of course, a civil action for a settlement. So the other side in a civil case in New York will be saying, well, we demand some kind of restitution. It's quite likely in these cases that there will be a payoff. Do you think that's likely to happen? In other words, lawyers representing Prince Andrew might well consider making an offer, making a cash offer to the other side to close the case. Does that look like a likely outcome to you?
I think that might be the case, but certainly, the feedback coming from, as I said, from the accuser is that I don't think it's a financial, I suppose, compensation that they're looking for. I think it's more about justice, and it's looking to get the actual side of it. I know this has been ongoing for a number of years, and it took a long time, obviously, through Epstein and through, obviously, Ghislaine Maxwell to bring the case to fruition. I think this is more about justice rather than any financial recompense. So that may be a negotiated position, who knows? But I have a distinct feeling this time that it's going to be more than just financial recompense. I think this is more about justice and justice to be seen in the case.
Well, and that perhaps leads us to a possible criminal case. This, of course, is a civil action, and there is no allegation here of any law being broken. So are you suggesting that if this action proceeds, as it proceeds, if it goes to court, that might encourage a New York prosecutor to raise a criminal case? Have you heard anything?
It may. I mean, you can only, obviously, I'm not a legal expert, but certainly listening to some of the commentary, both in the TV and radio in the last few days, I think that's certainly been looked as an option, and certainly from the team that represents the accuser, I think it's very much at the moment it's more the justice rather than the recompense and being almost being settled out of court. But how that would impact on the family if there's a guilty conviction after that, I don't think it's going to do any good. Put it that way. Whether it's terminal or not, time will tell. I think it would take more than that at the moment, but it's certainly going to be a case that's not going to go away, I don't think.
Yeah, and of course this is a particularly awkward time for the royal family because Buckingham Palace is looking forward to 22 as a year of the Platinum Jubilee. And we've discussed earlier on, members of the UK government are talking about a Festival of Britain or something like that. So this was supposed to be a big celebration year. So does this really put the brakes on the whole of that national celebration?
It may or may not, and I've come out before and publicly said that I'm a Republican and always have been, and it's nothing against the royal family in the UK. It's monarchy for me as an institution in any part of the world. So I have nothing against the family. I just think we'd be better served by obviously an independent Scotland with an elected head of state. So it may put a dampener on that when it comes round. I think the timing isn't going to be good for the celebrations at that time. I'm sure that the court case, whether it's civil or whether it moves to judiciary, will still be going on, I think.
Now, I haven't actually heard any opinion polls recently on the question of should the royal family be disestablished. I know there's lots of polls out on parties, and roughly the independence question is something like 50-50. I'm not aware of any polls recently discussing whether Scotland should be independent and a republic. Well, first of all, what's your personal opinion? Should the people of Scotland choose to become an independent country, do you think there would be a later, separately, another poll on setting up a republic?
Yeah, I think it's at some stage, there certainly should be. I think obviously the first thing is about an independent Scotland would be creating, I suppose a country, behind it, whether that's looking at the constitution, whether it's obviously looking at the settings of a new country. That's most important. I certainly think there would be a demand at some stage to talk around about, what would the elected head of state be. And I think that would come probably later down the line. But the first things first is moving towards and getting an independence referendum, setting up the normal mechanisms of an independent country. and making sure we hit the ground running once we do vote, and then move towards the actual moving towards becoming an independent country. But I'm sure at some stage that would come through and be discussed.
Yes, as I said, I've no idea what the current voting would be on Republic on both sides of the border. I haven't seen anything on that. But basically, your personal opinion would be one step at a time, right? So
yes.
An independence referendum first, and then we'll discuss we'll discuss the Constitution later on. A final point on the Prince Andrew imbroglio is, of course, that New York lawyers are not cheap, I don't suppose. I've never had to request legal help in New York. But who's paying for this? The legal bill itself, even if there isn't an out-of-court settlement, the legal bill is going to be hundreds of thousands, isn't it?
Yeah, I would imagine that would have to come from Prince Andrew himself. Now, where he finances it from, I'm not sure. And as you said, I think that probably New York lawyers are probably the most expensive in the world. So we'll see where that one goes. I think that's going to be interesting to see where that where that ends up. But I think it's going to be a story that's going to be with us for months and possibly years ahead.
Yes, we did announce the other day when Judge Kaplan's decision was in the papers that it will probably be late in the autumn. So that's why I said we'll just place a dark cloud over the celebrations this year, because it's likely that this will be running right through to the autumn, unless, of course, there's a settlement made before then. Right, so as you said, Paul, we're definitely going to hear more of that story. But in the meantime, the story is that the Duke has been relieved of all of his military affiliations at the request of a group of veterans who wrote to the Queen today. Now let's move on to our next story, which has been rumbling in the news all day, and more of it from last night and more today. That Scottish Conservative colleagues of yours in the Scottish Parliament, Paul, have been dismissed as lightweights. And this is a story that the SNP has said that the Tory civil war is making the case for independence, as senior Conservative dismissed and belittled the views of their own Conservative MSPs. In a series of interviews last night, senior Tory Cabinet Minister and Leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, dismissed Douglas Ross as a lightweight and repeatedly said, "I don't think he's a big figure." It follows similar media comments by Michael Gove, who heads up Boris Johnson's campaign against Scottish independence, who dismissed Douglas Ross by saying, "My instant response is that he's in Elgin and the National Tory leader is in London." Speaking to BBC Good Morning Scotland this morning, former Tory MSP Adam Tompkins hit back, describing the comments as very rude and dismissive. Commenting, the SNP's Westminster Deputy Leader Kirsten Oswald MP has said, "By dismissing their Scottish branch office as a bunch of lightweights and nobodies, the Tories are revealing their disdain for Scotland and making the case for independence. Not only is it deeply humiliating for Douglas Ross, but it's a telling insight into the arrogant and dismissive attitude that the Tory government has towards Scotland as a whole. They are looking down their noses at us and making it clear just how little Scotland's views matter to them, like they did with Brexit and Tory austerity cuts." Scottish Tory MPs, including Douglas Ross, put Boris Johnson in power, and like loyal stooges, they have rubber-stamped every damaging decision from Brexit to universal benefit cuts, and yet they're still belittled and brushed aside by their Westminster leaders. If this is what the Tories think of their own Scottish MPs, imagine what they think about the rest of us. So indeed, that must have been a difficult one for Douglas Ross to take. I don't know if you've had a chance to speak to him today. How does he feel by being dismissed in this way?
I haven't had a chance to speak to Douglas Ross today, but certainly there's been more press activity in the Parliament than there has been in the last few weeks, and obviously looking to speak to Douglas Ross. But I think it's I think in the chamber today, you've seen groups of Tory MSPs chatting away, and obviously discussing the situation. And I think obviously we've seen Jamie Green and Douglas Ross being interviewed today, and I think there's a very clear schism now between Conservative MSPs and MPs. And I think the interesting thing is you've seen Tory MPs down in London, Scottish Tory MPs down in London, not saying as much. I think Alistair Jack came out and defended, and tried to defend obviously Douglas Ross, but defended the Prime Minister but you've not seen any other Tory MPs, Scottish Tory MPs, come out. So I think there's a very deep schism. But it's almost ironic, being an SNP elected member. One of the key things that we often see is disdain for the Scottish political system and for Holyrood itself. And now we're seeing disdain of Tory MSPs who are in Holyrood, and it's almost like welcome to our world. And I think this situation will go on. It becomes almost unthinkable if Boris Johnson remains. What's the relationship going to be between the Scottish Conservative MPs and Prime Minister? And we've been reading today that obviously he wouldn't possibly be invited to their conference, which is due in March, which is almost unthinkable. They've never been in a position where they've not had a UK leader come up. So again, I think it points out there's only one way to try and clean up the system up here in Scotland, and that's for an independent Scotland where we make our own decisions. But it's what's happened in the last few days. Has highlighted the problems of having the Tory party down in London controlling most of what happens up here.
Yes, now Kirsten Oswald herself, I think, used the phrase that the Scottish Tories are regarded as a branch office, and that's a phrase that was used earlier on about Scottish Labour Party. So they both share in common the fact that they have a head office in London, so really the Scottish branch of both parties. Well, maybe they need to devolve themselves. I suppose this is a bit of a long shot, but could you see any sign of the Scottish Conservatives rebranding? I mean, it's not the first time that facing defeat at an election that the Scottish Conservatives have, some of them, including I think Murdo Fraser, have said, why don't we just relaunch, give everything a new name and completely separate? That is right. Do you hear any possibility that Scottish Tories might do a rebrand?
Obviously I haven't heard anything in the chamber. I know Murdo Fraser has talked about that before. I know Adam Tompkins was talking about that obviously when he was interviewed just a few days ago as well. And that may be an exercise in rebranding, and if the Tories think that's going to solve the problem, then it's not, because regardless of whether they rebrand, in Scotland, and even if Boris Johnson goes, it's not going to change the fundamentals. Whether it's Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss that would come in, the situation is that the Scottish Conservative Party, and whether Douglas Ross believes it or not, take the lead of the UK Conservative Party. Where most of the decisions are made. And one prime example where we've seen in the last number of months was through universal credit. We had universal credit cuts being implicated and pushed down in London, and debate after debate after debate, we watched Scottish Conservative MSPs sit their hands and not say a word, despite the impact they knew it was going to have on their own constituents. They knew that, yet they took the orders of the UK Conservative Party, sat on their hands and never said a word, and actually voted for motions, voted against motions criticising the universal credit cut. So regardless of whether Boris Johnson goes, regardless of whether they change the branding, the fundamentals won't change. They take the lead of the UK Conservative Party, and all is well.
Yeah, I suppose you could trace back the Scottish Tory attitude really to Ruth Davidson's attempts 2 years ago, was it, to block Boris Johnson's move towards the Tory leadership, and she in fact behind the scenes started to organise to say Scottish Tories are not in favour of this, but she lost that one of course, and she's now effectively retired from politics. So could it be that the only reason the Tories are moving now in Scotland is because they're losing, they're way behind in the polls? And Douglas Ross himself has a very small majority, hasn't he? At least in his Westminster seat, or are they just worried about their own jobs?
I think they will, and again, I think it comes down to when you see one thing that the Conservatives are they're quite ruthless when they think they're going to damage politically, and I think that will be the ultimate judgment call of whether Boris Johnson stays or not. If Tory MPs believe he'll damage them electorally, they will get rid of him. If they don't, he'll stay. It's nothing to do with morality around about what's happened and around about the parties and so on. And I think the same will be the same of the Scottish Conservative MPs. Whether they think he's going to continue to damage him or not. And I am looking forward to when the next opinion poll comes out in Scotland about the impact that's having. I think that the Conservative Party are falling back. In recent polls, I think they'll fall back even further in terms of where they are, despite Douglas Ross trying to distance himself. People still see the link between the Scottish Conservatives and the UK Conservative Party. They don't stand up for Scotland, and they never will stand up for Scotland.
Yeah, that's true. And yeah, just to finally, before we move on, yeah, The Guardian does report that Scottish Tories are not planning on inviting Prime Minister Johnson to the spring conference in March, and The Guardian reports that as unprecedented. So, difficult times for Scottish Tories. Right, well, let's move on then. And the next story we're going to look at tonight is down here is Sajid Javid, the UK Health Secretary, cuts the COVID isolation period to 5 days for England only, of course. English Health Secretary Sajid Javid has confirmed that the minimum time people with COVID in England have to spend in self-isolation is to be cut to 5 full days. From Monday, people would be able to leave isolation on day 6 if they tested negative on days 5 and 6, Mr Javid told the Commons. Sajid Javid was updating MPs today, a day after Boris Johnson said a decision would be made on the issue as fast as possible. The government has been under pressure to bring the situation in England into line with the United States, where the isolation period has been cut to 5 days. In her statement to the Scottish Parliament on Tuesday, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said that people in Scotland would still have to isolate for 7 days in accordance with the UK Health Security Agency, that's the UKHSA advice. Current UKHSA guidance is for people with COVID to isolate for at least 6 full days from the point at which they have symptoms or a positive test, whichever came first, with release from self-isolation after 2 negative lateral flow tests on days 6 and 7. Then people, assuming they get a negative test, can leave self-isolation on day 7. So Paul, in England then, coming in next Monday, that 7 days is brought down to 5 days. I had a look at the World Health Organization, WHO, today, and they seem to be not 100% sure. They say that if you bring it down from 7 to 6 to 5, you slightly increase the risk of infection, but basically they said it's up for governments to make that call. It's a balanced judgment that governments will have to make. So is the Scottish Government still erring on the side of caution?
Yeah, and I think it should be at this time. I think, we recently reduced from 10 days to 7 days, and I think there still needs to be that clinical advice and the evidence behind the move to the 7 days to make sure, that we're continuing to, I suppose the good sign is the case numbers seem to be coming down, but I think at this stage we need more evidence around about the 7 days isolation before we went any further than that. And I think, WHO have said it's a political decision, and quite rightly, I think over the term of the pandemic, I think the Scottish Government have been quite rightly more cautious than the UK Government, and I think that's the best approach to take just now. And the figures I read also as well was around about between after day 5, a third of people are still infectious after day 5. So I think it's too early at this stage to look at that. And I think the Cabinet Secretary Hamza Yousaf has said it's not something they're looking at the moment. I think we need more evidence if that's the situation. I don't think there's many countries in the world that are doing that at this stage. So I think it's a watching brief. But certainly, the moment and the clinical advice that's been given to Scottish Government is to stay on to the 7 days. And I think public health has to come first. I can understand the demand for reducing the isolation period because obviously it's having an impact on services, whether that's the NHS or other services that are there. But we have to err on the side of caution. If the pandemic takes off again, then it's going to impact us even more. So yes, at this stage, I'd support erring on the side of caution. And continue to take evidence on what impact the 7 day isolation period is having following its reduction from 10 days.
Right, so at the moment the Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf is still saying 7 days because there will be that increased risk of spread if we shorten that. Just to go back to the coronavirus statistics we looked at earlier on, there is a greater spread in England presumably because of the relaxation of the measures. For instance, we had 1 more in intensive care, but 8 more in England, UK, and we had another 26 deaths, but 338, I think it was, down south. Well, that's mainly in England, but that includes the whole of the UK figures. So, of course, the greater mitigation measures in Scotland are actually keeping the numbers of infections down. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think right through the course of the pandemic, the Conservatives have talked about for removing masks from schools. which proved not to be, if we had gone down that route. And the First Minister made that point today, when we were talking about, when it was discussed in First Minister's question time, really talking about that the Scottish Government have been more cautious in their approach, and the Conservatives have asked for removal of masks, have asked for things to open up far too quickly. And I think during the course of the pandemic, we've seen case numbers in Scotland generally lower, and I think we have to err on the side of caution when it comes to public health. That has to be the number one concern, and I think the reason that the cases are falling so quickly just now, obviously, one is around about the mitigation that we put in, two around about obviously public behaviour, which I think people are recognise what we need to do, and I think we've seen that in the course of the pandemic when we've had surgeries. People need to change their behaviours, and sometimes that needs to be legislation that's brought in. And we've seen the number of people at the moment who are either isolating or have Omicron, and that's impacted on services. So the cautious approach is the right one to take at the moment. The quicker we can get the case numbers down, the quicker we can ease the restrictions again and get business up and running as quickly and possibly as we can.
Yes, but the key thing is keeping the number of infections down. I noticed today in the Scottish Parliament at First Minister's questions, Douglas Ross said that the First Minister had been exaggerating and that the numbers of infections were not as high as she warned in December. But she came back and said, yes, that's because we've been taking precautions. If we hadn't done those mitigations, that's what would have happened. So yes, as you say, the measures we are taking is part of the equation.
Yeah, it's spot on, and I think that has to be the case. And I said, I've always supported, and I don't think this is a political point. I think this is just in terms of what's best for public health, and I think the cautious approach has been proved to that. And I don't think it's just a political view. I think when you look at various opinion polls from throughout Scotland about how they think the Scottish Government have handled it, it's in excess of 70-80%. So I think the public have been broadly supportive of around about how the Scottish Government has approached this. And quite rightly, I think public health has to come first.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so at the moment, no change to the isolation rules in Scotland, although they're going down to 5 days from next Monday south of the border. Okay, still in England, we've heard today that Professor Jonathan Van Tam, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for England, whose knack for analogies helped to convey the twists and turns of the COVID crisis, is stepping down from his government role. Professor Van Tam, professor who was also knighted in the most recent New Year Honours list, is to leave his post at the end of March for a new role at the University of Nottingham. Health Secretary Sajid Javid said it had been an honour to work with JVT, as he is known, and praised him for his unique approach to explaining crucial information to the public. Sources close to Professor Van Tam said his departure was not prompted by the crisis at Number 10 over parties and alleged COVID rule-breaking. However, he has previously made his view known, telling a press conference in May 2020 that rules have always been clear and that, in my opinion, they apply to all. Professor Van Tam became Deputy Chief Medical Officer for England in 2017. He has worked alongside Professor Chris Whitty, the Chief Medical Officer for England, and Sir Patrick Vallance, the UK Government's Chief Science Advisor throughout the pandemic. His presence at Downing Street briefings and interviews with the media and a flair for metaphors to describe the situation the UK found itself in made him a household name. Professor Chris Whitty said, Jonathan Van Tam has been an outstanding deputy and public servant. I am profoundly thankful for his steadfast support, advice, leadership and commitment. His communication of public health advice and science has been remarkable. Yes, so would you agree with the general view then that Professor Van Tam was very good at communicating very complicated scientific messages to the public in general?
Yeah, I think he was. I mean, I think he done it in his own unique style, and I think I think we'll all miss that. I know he was very well respected, and it's been mentioned by our own clinical director Jason Leach had mentioned that as well. So I think he was very well respected, and he has been one of the faces of the pandemic, and I think he will be missed in his own unique style of trying to put the message across. And now, whether that it's good time or not, I understand that he was on secondment from the University of Nottingham and he's going back to another role. But I think he's been very clear that in terms of the restrictions that we needed to follow, that he was very clear on that. And whether it's a coincidence, I'm not sure. I certainly think if it has been a coincidence, I think he would probably feel really uncomfortable just now standing up by the Prime Minister after the number of cases we've seen from the Prime Minister about breaking the rules. And I understand, looking at programmes last night, that they still think there are other instances of other parties that are still to come out. So it may be a coincidence. I think he will be missed, but I think he'll probably feel, I think he would have felt really uncomfortable if he had still been there standing next to the Prime Minister after what's been going on in the last number of weeks.
Yeah, yes, it's fascinating to look at the faces of the advisors on either side of the Prime Minister. But yes, so anyway, well done, Professor Jonathan Van Tam, and we wish him well in his new post, or returning to the post he was doing before. Now, also a COVID-related story next. We hear today, well, Next and IKEA are both cutting sick pay for staff who are not vaccinated. Next has become one of the first large UK retailers to cut sick pay for its unvaccinated staff who have to isolate if they came into contact with somebody with COVID. However, staff who have not been jagged will still receive sick pay if they test positive for the virus. People in the UK who are not vaccinated and who are a close contact of someone who has tested positive are required to self-isolate now for 10 days. This requirement does not apply for people who are fully vaccinated, as we said earlier. Next has said this was an emotive topic, but they had to balance the needs of staff and shareholders. The fashion and homeware retailer, which employs more than 37,000 people in the UK, has been grappling with higher levels of staff absence as a result of the spread of the Omicron variant. Next's change to its sick pay policy is understood to have been made recently and comes days after a similar move by IKEA, which employs 10,000 people in the UK. Unvaccinated workers at Next and IKEA will only be eligible for statutory sick pay, which is currently set at £96.35 a week during the 10 days of isolation, unless there are mitigating circumstances. This compares with the weekly pay of more than £400 before tax for an average store worker at IKEA. So the issue here, I guess, is about rights and whose rights. Do individual workers have the right to say, I decide what goes into my body, I decide if I get jagged or not? Or does that overlap with other people's rights to work with colleagues they know are not likely to be spreaders? Is it a clash of two rights, really?
I think this is it's a tricky one, I think, in terms of where we go and the legalities around about it. I know, obviously, in other parts of the world it's been looked at. I know President Macron, from France, obviously talked around about, his view on people who are unvaccinated. In Quebec, I understand today they're going to be adding a health tax on to people who haven't been vaccinated as well, because of obviously the vast number of people who are in hospital throughout the world now are unvaccinated. In terms of the legal position for people who aren't vaccinated in terms of pay, I think that's going to have to be left to employment lawyers to look at and where they go from that one. I think there could be a few legal challenges on that. I think there are different ways we can try and address people who haven't been vaccinated, and I think that's key. There's obviously a very heavy group of evidence now that shows that the vast majority of people who are now in hospital are hospitalised and sadly die are people who are unvaccinated. I think it needs some more thought, and I know it's been raised within the Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament. Whether it's right at the moment, I'm not sure. I really understand the drive to get people vaccinated, and people for their own reason decide that they won't. I think there will be legal challenges on this one. I understand why IKEA would be going down that route. I'm not quite sure at this stage that's the best way to go, and along with Next. And I think there will be legal challenges, and I think it's a role maybe for public health bodies to work with these companies, and work with the employees to make sure they get the message about how strongly it is advisable in terms of health, that they need to get the vaccine. And there's overwhelming evidence out there now. And the more that this is studied, the more the evidence stacks up in terms of the number of people who are vaccinated and in hospital is much more than people who are unvaccinated. And I think there needs to be work with these companies to try and understand that. I can understand why they're doing it. I'm not quite sure this is the best approach, and I think we need to live with COVID and whatever variant it may or may come up. And I think that's an issue that needs a little bit more thought to do that. But I'm sure there will be a legal challenge on behalf of this. And it'll be interesting to see what the unions say on behalf of this as well. So it's an interesting one. But my clear message would be to anybody: get vaccinated. And there is overwhelming evidence. Get vaccinated. Protect yourself. Protect others. Protect your family.
Yep. I suppose it's worth guessing that the majority of people who at this stage have refused to be vaccinated probably have some belief that it's not tested properly, or it's a plot, or it's a conspiracy. So I'm making a big assumption there. But if by now 2 years into it somebody's refusing vaccination, it's probably because they've got some kind of ideological objection to it. Do you have any sympathy for people who might feel that this is my body, I decide what I'm doing with it?
I think there may be some, if it's religious, if it's religious beliefs, if it's conspiracy theories, I don't know. I think there's a real issue around about disinformation that's out there on the internet. Some of the discussions I've had, most of the times you get referred to the internet, and I think there's a real. I know Stewart McDonald, MP down, was talking around about looking at disinformation and how we manage that, and I think a lot of it is around about disinformation. And I think that's something that we need to look at very much so. And I think there's an element of that. We need to look at disinformation around about that and how we address that. And it's not talking obviously around about censorship, because that's not what the answer. But there has to be some review of disinformation that goes out there, because I think that's where the vast majority of people get their views in that regard. So I understand why people may hold that view. I certainly don't endorse it, don't believe it, but I think there's a four-nation approach needed in terms of the people who are unvaccinated. What do we need to do to try and do that? And that may be individual discussions, individual target, and I'm not sure, because there is still a substantial number of people who haven't been vaccinated in Scotland and in the rest of the UK, and of course across the world. And until we raise that number, we're still leaving ourselves very much open until to future variants coming through, and again having pressures on the NHS that we really can't, because again, the more pressures we have, it's going to take more time until we get back to some sort of normality within the health system.
Yep. So your point is it's a public health issue, right? And let's forget.
I think very much so. I think I'm sure this will be challenged legal position, and there's no precedence to this. I think this is obviously it's unprecedented. So whether the legal advice would come in this, I'm not sure, but I'm sure there will be legal challenges. But again, reiterating to people, get vaccinated. The evidence is overwhelming how much it protects you, your family, and obviously the rest of the population.
Yes, indeed, that's what we do in Broadcasting Scotland. Ever since the Omicron was announced, actually, we've been testing before we come into the studio, so we definitely don't want to stop broadcasting.
No, and we do that. I do that every day before I come into the Parliament, before I meet anybody. It's a lateral flow test every single time, and I'd encourage people to do that.
Yep. Okay, thank you, Paul. So the next story, we've heard today that the new chair of the Scottish Drugs Death Task Force has been announced. He's David Strang, former Chief Constable who previously chaired the independent inquiry into mental health services in Tayside. Mr. Strang was also the HM Chief Inspector of Prisons for Scotland. He takes up his new position with immediate effect. A vice chair will be announced shortly. Meanwhile, the first step towards the development of the proposal on how a safer drugs consumption room might work within existing legislation has been made. The Glasgow Health and Social Care Partnership has now provided the details of a new service proposal in relation to a potential safer drug consumption facility. The Scottish Government, working closely with Police Scotland and the Crown Office, and in line with a recent statement from a Lord Advocate, is examining how this proposal to consider how such a facility would operate and would be policed. Once this work is completed, a final proposal will be put to the Lord Advocate for consideration. Drugs Policy Minister Angela Constance said, "I am pleased to appoint David Strang as chair of a drugs death task force. He has a vast amount of experience across a number of areas which will stand him in good stead for the challenges ahead. This change in leadership marks a new chapter for what has been a valued contributor to work being done all across Scotland, and I want to thank the former chair and vice chair for the parts they played in shaping our collective response to reducing drug-related deaths. I have asked the task force to accelerate its final recommendations planned for this year, and I'm aiming to get those in summer. So Paul, let me first of all take up that question of accelerating the report. Let's get this report out quick, because of course the reason the previous chair and vice chair resigned, which was I think just before Christmas, is because they felt they were put under unreasonable time pressure. So I take it Mr. Strang is well aware that speed is of the essence here.
Yeah, I mean, and it was interesting to you because I actually took part and spoke in the debate this afternoon. There was a debate on the first year of the national mission, you know, around about that, and obviously Mr. Strang, David Strang, was talked about. I had the pleasure of meeting David on a number of occasions in his role in the police. Very dedicated police officer, very much aware, not just in terms of policing and operational matters, but around about obviously the policy making issues around about that as well. So I'm sure he will do a fantastic job. And obviously he was Inspector of Prisons as well. So I think David will be welcomed. I think he'll do a good job. I think the first year we've made some progress. I think the next year is going to be focused on implementation, and I think that's why the Minister was really focused on trying to bring forward some of these recommendations, particularly back before July sort of thing. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that progressing, and we mentioned obviously around about the proposals by Glasgow. I think that's something that we need to move on and quickly today. I know there's been criticism of the Scottish Government, but I think today's debate was very, I suppose in a kind of way, it was quite, there was a lot of views shared that people agreed with, and I think that was heartening. I think we all need to move ahead and implement some of the recommendations. And certainly the consumption rooms in Glasgow was raised in debate on a number of times. And ultimately, it's still reserved. The Misuse of Drugs Act is still reserved down in Westminster. And I think right across the chamber, I think that there was certainly support for bringing these in. We need to be doing that. And I think it was Paul Sweeney, MSP, mentioned the point. Would you rather see people take drugs up an alleyway in Glasgow or in a safe consumption, clean consumption room? I certainly support that. We need to be bringing these on in all parts of the country. So, the quicker we can do that, the better.
Yes, I did hear Paul Sweeney's remarks in the debate this afternoon. I'm sorry I missed yours. I was looking at the second half of the debate. Yes, now he made the point that what we are doing is, in fact, not breaking the law. A strict interpretation of the UK 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act would say if you give anybody a Class A drug, you're a criminal. So he said, well, I did that. I helped people in Peter Crykant's ambulance, and I'm not in jail, right? So that shows that we're kind of decriminalising. So let's just focus on that point. One of the policies which has now been voted on by the Parliament today is that the safe drugs consumption facilities will be provided. So that's now Scottish Government policy. But it's still actually against the 1971 Dangerous Drugs Act. So is this a kind of model for devolution, do you think? If there's something that we can't do, just do it anyway?
I think this is, again, this is part of the issues you get around about devolution. Some of the powers we can do something up here, some of the powers are obviously reserved to London. I think that kind of highlights some of the inadequacies of devolution. I think in terms of what's been heartening for me over the last number of months is we're moving away from the drugs issue, being talking about criminal activity and decriminalisation. We're talking around about this being an addiction. It's a medical issue, and and that's heartening to see now. People see that, and one of the things we talked about today in the Parliament was trying to remove the stigma. The stigma is still there for people, and that's certainly something I raised in my speech around about people who obviously suffer from addiction, their families, and even the communities who suffer from that as well. So there's much to be done in regards to that. And obviously, I think the statements a few months ago by the Advocate General talking about the decriminalisation sort of thing, I said that. So we're moving in the right direction. The stigma is still there. We need to remove that. We need to work with families and the people who suffer from addictions and the communities to make sure that's removed. That people who need the treatment are able to come forward and do it without being stigmatised. But I think we're moving in the right direction. I certainly think we're moving away from the criminal side of things to people seeing it as a medical issue, and long may that continue, because I think if we can continue to do that, we will make progress. There's much work to be done, but I think we're making progress.
Yep, so this is the start. So as you said, there was widespread support in the Parliament today, and I think the measure was passed without objection, wasn't it? So
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there was a few amendments by both the Conservative and Labour parties, but when it came to the motion by the Scottish Government, it was passed by acclaim. So yeah, which was good to see, and I think there's a lot of cross-party work and discussions that are ongoing, and again, that's good to see. And it truly is a national mission. It's something we're all need to get behind politically to make sure that we bring these numbers down. And I'm confident with the approach that Angela Constance has brought to this and our dedication to it. I think we'll start to see drug deaths reduce in Scotland.
Excellent. So we can look forward positively to some progress on that area.
Yeah.
Okay, a couple of stories left now before we're out of time tonight. Next, The Guardian today has reported that the Home Office has told asylum seekers from some of the world's biggest conflict zones that it's safe for them to return. A 36-year-old from Yemen and a 21-year-old from Afghanistan have both had their asylum claims rejected by government officials on the basis that they would not be at risk in their home countries. The disclosure follows the case of a 25-year-old Syrian asylum seeker who was told it would be safe for him to go back to Syria. The Home Office's own guidance, as well as that of the UNHCR, warns of the danger of returning refugees to countries such as Syria, Afghanistan and Yemen. The Syrian man, who sought sanctuary in the UK in May 2020, was told by a Home Office official who rejected his asylum claim that it would be safe for him to return. He fled forced subscription into Bashar al-Assad's army in 2017, saying that he would have been forced to kill other Syrians. He said that if he is forced back to Syria, he will be targeted as a draft evader, arrested, detained and killed. While the Home Office has accepted that he did flee forced conscription, the refusal letter states, "It is not accepted that you will face a risk of prosecution or real risk of serious harm on returning to the Syrian Arab Republic due to your imputed political opinion as a draft evader." The UNHCR said that while it cannot comment on individual cases, it calls on states to suspend forcible returns of asylum seekers to countries which remain volatile or lack sufficient security or are unable to offer adequate human rights protection. A spokesman added, Afghanistan, Yemen and Syria are among the countries which the UNHCR recommends forcible returns should be avoided. While conflict has subsided in Afghanistan, a humanitarian emergency is ongoing, making return inappropriate. In both Yemen and Syria, the dire humanitarian context is compounded by conflict and insecurity. So this is, Paul, the Home Office knows better. People from Afghanistan and Syria and the United Nations say this is dangerous, but the Home Office says it's okay, you'll be fine. How do they know?
Yeah, I find this staggering, and it's not the first time that I've been on broadcast in Scotland talking about issues similar to this. And yeah, again, we've got a body of evidence, from the UNHCR and from United Nations and so on. A heavy body of evidence showing that these countries aren't safe to return to. And I just find it incredible. What does it say around about the UK? I just find it incredible. They're not safe. Syria's not safe at the moment. And the ironic thing for me, when you talk around about the Yemen and the conflict with Saudi Arabia, the UK is the biggest supplier of arms to Saudi Arabia that keeps the conflict going, and yet they're still in the position that they want to return refugees there. After being the biggest provider of arms, I find it incredible. And again, it's indicative of what UK foreign policy is. And again, I think I've mentioned this on the programme before, is in terms of, one of the benefits, major benefits of an independent Scotland would be able to be a peacekeeping nation like many other small independent countries are, rather than being a country that prolongs wars such as Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So, the quicker we can have our own foreign policy making, the better. But I find it staggering, not from just a political point of view, but from just actually being a human being, actually sending people back to conflict zones and what's happening in either, whether it's Afghanistan, as you said, Syria, Yemen. I just find it incredible. I really do.
An astonishing decision, very hard to explain. Our second last story tonight, Paul. Very quickly, we hear today another international story. A German court today, Thursday, jailed an ex-Syrian intelligence officer for life for murder, rape and crimes against humanity, handing down the first ever conviction for state-backed torture committed during Syria's civil war following a landmark trial. Anwar, forgot his second name, I'll get to him in a minute, was found guilty of 27 out of 58 counts of murder, rape and sexual assault carried out at a Damascus prison run by a unit of Bashar al-Assad's security services, which he headed. The 58-year-old, a colonel when he defected to the Syrian opposition in 2012, who prosecutors said was granted asylum in Germany 2 years later, had denied all charges. The Assad government denies it tortures prisoners. The trial was conducted under Germany's universal jurisdiction laws, which allow courts to prosecute crimes against humanity committed anywhere in the world. Prosecutors supported by the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights, that's the HCCHR, had gathered evidence since 2016 from nearly 50 Syrian torture survivors living in Germany and from others based elsewhere in Europe, according to the HCCHR. A second trial of a Syrian doctor suspected of crimes against humanity, including torturing prisoners at a military hospital in Homs in 2011 and 12, and killing one using a lethal injection, opens in Frankfurt next week. At the UN Security Council, Russia and China have vetoed attempts by Western powers to refer the Syrian crisis to the International Criminal Court, leaving survivors of torture and chemical weapons attacks with limited options to seek justice. So this is, Paul, a landmark trial in Germany because it would not have been possible to get convictions on war crimes through the United Nations if Russia blocks it, but Germany has been able to prosecute it on itself under its own laws. So does this maybe another way where people who are guilty of abuses of this kind will have to watch their back?
Yeah, and I welcome that. I think obviously the legal jurisdictions in Germany and whichever country decides to be doing that obviously have to meet international law. But yeah, I certainly welcome that. I mean, we've seen atrocities being carried out in Syria and over a number of years, and I think now we're facing a tricky situation in Bosnia as well, and we've seen the conflict in Bosnia and the old Yugoslavia, and it took a number of years to bring war criminals there as well. So I think the more opportunities and I think the more avenues to try and bring these cases forward, I think has to be welcomed. I think, and a word of caution is obviously that needs to meet international law, and I think we'll obviously see geopolitical influences. Talked about the influence of China and Russia and so on, but I think we need to try and strengthen the jurisdiction around about that as much as we possibly can, because people can't go away, do what they're doing over a number of years, commit these crimes and think they can walk away from it. And I think I welcome the judgment. And I said the word of caution is we need to make sure that it meets the international law. But I'm sure the German government have seen that and done that. So yeah, I welcome that. And if it stops people doing what they've been doing over a number of years, then that's very welcome.
Yes, it was Anwar Razlam was the name of this gentleman. As you say, Paul, he first of all changed sides. He was with the security forces then in 2012. He decided to join the opposition and then went to Germany seeking asylum, but the crimes had already been committed before that. So this is saying to people, if you've committed some crimes, there's no use changing sides afterwards and pretending that's going to make it go away. Right, we're finishing tonight on a story back at home now. The Scottish Government has announced a £4 million funding package to help provide support for unpaid carers in recognition of the enormous role they play in looking after loved ones and the added pressure many have faced during the pandemic. Over the next few weeks, the additional winter funding will allow organisations working with unpaid carers to expand the services they provide to groups of adult and young carers, including those looking after disabled children and young people and those caring for a friend or relative with dementia. To help reach as wide a range of carers as possible, the funds will be shared between organisations who are already working with different groups of carers. For example, £3 million for local carer centres across Scotland to expand their vital support for adult and young carers. There will be £200,000 to expand the Young Carers package delivered by Young Scot to provide additional break opportunities, support and activities for young carers. There will be £377,000 to expand family fund support, with breaks for parents and family looking after disabled children and young people. There will also be £590,000 to expand well-being support and services for unpaid carers, looking after a family member with dementia, and that again includes grants for short breaks. The Minister for Mental Wellbeing and Social Care, Kevin Stewart, said, "Unpaid carers play a vital role in society, and I know the pandemic has placed many additional pressures on Scotland's carers. The Scottish Government has always been committed to improving carers' rights and providing them with the support and extra help they deserve." So, Paul, these measures will be widely welcomed. In particular, I think young carers have up to now played an enormous role and received very little help for it. So is this enough, do you think? Is this going to make a significant dent on the responsibilities?
I think it's very welcome. And only yesterday I met with the carers of East Lothian, who represent the carers in East Lothian, obviously, and I spoke to around about they had a panel, around about 7 or 8 people who care. Some for younger people, some for elderly relatives, and so on. And one of the big issues as they came up was around about the local care centres and almost signposting advocacy services and so on. So I know the £3 million that's been set aside for local carer centres will be much welcomed. In terms of the young carers package, I think that's vitally important, and the role they've played over the pandemic and looking after parents and then having to cope with the school and what they're doing as well has been incredible, absolutely incredible. The family fund support you talked about, and obviously respite, especially in where we've been, is welcome. And the other thing we talked about today was in the Parliament was talking about holistic family care as well. So there was a debate around about that. I know the Scottish Government have set aside 500 million over the next 5 years in terms of broader family support. And again, I think that we'll look into that where that would fit in terms of care providers as well. So it's much welcomed, and it really came. It was perfect timing for myself in terms of the discussions I had yesterday and the issues that kind of came out of that. Signposting is a massive part of it. Advocacy is a massive part of it, and it's a case of a lot of the cases joining the dots. Where do people need help? What can we do? Where is it provided on a local basis? So the funding that's been announced today, I think, will be very, very welcomed. I'm looking forward to seeing the difference it can make in East Lothian. But we can't underestimate, the role of unpaid carers, particularly in the last couple of years with the pandemic. It's incredible the work that these people do, and we should all be very, very thankful to the work that they do, and they continue to
yes,
do.
exactly.
They keep over. So
yeah, vital. Yes. So again, that's £4 million funding to help carers who up to now who are really unpaid but doing a vital role, right? And that's our final story tonight, Paul. So thank you very much to Paul McLennan for joining us over in the Scottish Parliament. And that just remains for me to say that I'd like to thank our viewers and our subscribers for keeping Broadcasting Scotland going. We think in this station, and the reason we volunteer is because we think that Scotland needs a wider range of voices and independent broadcasting. And we only exist because of your support, right? So thank you for watching and thank you for subscribing. If you're not a subscriber, please have a look at the website and you can become one of our supporters starting off at £5 a month. So please consider doing that. And we have big plans for this year, and we just need some money to get those plans into action. Okay, so that's it from me tonight. So I'm back tomorrow. So thank you again to Paul McLennan for joining us at the Scottish Parliament. And that's us, and we'll see you later. Bye.